Hello again, and welcome to part 3 of this video series about getting started with your Fujifilm camera. Part number 1 was all about the settings menu, specifically the image quality and autofocus and manual focus. Part 2 was all about all the rest of the settings. I don't actually remember all of them right now. There's a lot. And then this part 3 will be about exposure modes and understanding a little bit about exposure. Part 4 will be about the Q menu and the viewfinder display. So I'll leave a link to all those videos down below. Additionally, I will also have chapter markers down below for the different segments here so that you can jump ahead as you need, or if you need to complete this in more than one sitting, it'll make it easy to get to the section you want. So this video is going to be all about exposure and how we manage that in our cameras. And one of the reasons exposure is so important is because we have an emotional connection and an emotional reaction to how light is displayed in a scene. So for example, scenes that are darker, we tend to be a little sadder about sometimes. We tend to feel the scene is quieter. We have a different reaction than a scene that is very bright, which tends to have more visual energy for our eyes. We tend to feel it's louder. So managing exposure is really important in a photo because photography, in the end, literally from the Greek word photography, means writing or drawing with light. So that's what the camera is all about. So let's get started with our conversation about exposure. I'm going to explain the elements of exposure first, then we'll deal with the camera controls, how to set them to control various aspects of exposure. So exposure, here's my simple definition. It's the process of managing lights in photos using 3 camera controls. And every camera ever made, as far as I'm aware, has had a variation of these 3 controls to determine exposure. The first one is shutter speed, the second one is aperture, and the third one is ISO. So I'll explain all of these individually in a moment. But before we begin, here's a question for you. What time of day was this photo taken? So there's some clues here, see if you can figure them out. So here's the answer. It was taken in the middle of the afternoon. It was at the top of a parking garage at a local mall, and it was a sunny day. But if you go to this photo, it doesn't look sunny. So by managing the light in the photo, I've created a different mood and feeling in this photo than this photo. So here's my short example of why this is important and how you can change so much in the photo just by changing exposure. So this photo, I think, has more emotional content. This photo is your dating profile picture, maybe. And then this photo is your LinkedIn profile photo for getting a job. This is descriptive, it's accurate, it gives more detail about the car in this case. This photo is more mysterious and leads you to want to know more and want to engage more. Another example I think that you could take from these 2 photos is that this is the photo to sell maybe 1 million cars. So you want this to sell the feeling of owning the car. And this photo is to sell 1 car, this specific car that looks like this. So neither one is right or wrong. Neither one is right or wrong. But your camera is not going to create that first photo, that dark, moody photo, if you're in automatic mode. It's not designed to do that. It's designed to do the second photo, which is the average amount of light, the correct amount of light. So sometimes we need both photos. And if you're not sure which one to make both. Make one that's got emotional impact because of exposure and one that's the exposure isn't having much of the effect on the story. It's more accurate and descriptive. So I'm going to talk more about how to control those different things, those different elements, to get you to those 2 different places potentially. An important note before we begin talking about each of the elements of exposure: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Each of those 3 you can use to make your photo brighter or darker, or correct, whatever you want to do. But each of them, in addition to potentially making the photo brighter and darker, also has another characteristic of the photo that they change. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the next little bit so that you're aware of the power of each of these in addition to making the photo brighter or darker. So we'll start with shutter speed. Here's some information about shutter speed. Shutter speed is the duration of light. It's how long from when you press the shutter is the sensor in your camera exposed to light, and it's usually measured in fractions of a second. We'll come back to that in a minute. One of the cool things about shutter speed is it's relatively easy to understand. If I have twice as much time, I have twice as much light in my photo. If I have half as much time, I have half as much light in my photo, and it will be darker. So understanding that's pretty easy. Depending on your relationship with fractions, understanding how which fraction is larger or smaller, and in that case, more or less light might be a little more complicated. So in addition to affecting how much light is in the photo, the brightness of the photo, here's what else changes with shutter speed, and that is the appearance of motion. So this is how you can have blur in your photo from things that are moving, or you can stop the motion, freeze the motion of something that's moving very quickly, and that is controlled by shutter speed. Related to that is this element. So if you shutter speeds gets to longer duration, so that's slower than 1/30th of a second. For most people, most cameras, there's some variations here. But you might get photos that are unintentionally blurry because the camera moved a little bit. So here's what I mean by that. When you're making the photo with your camera and you're at shutter speeds that are a little bit longer durations, what happens is it looks like you're doing this. Maybe not that drastic, but it kind of looks like that in the photo. There's blur in the photo, unintentionally. It's not sharp where you want it to be sharp because the camera moved just a little bit because you're alive, you're maybe not very steady, you were breathing, your heart was beating, you had caffeine. All those things might cause you to have a little bit of shake in your camera. Now, having said all that, modern cameras can offset that in two ways by at least a little bit. One is a lot of lenses now have a thing called image stabilization built into the lens. So it's basically kind of like a gyroscope that offsets motion, and it does that in the lens. Even more recent cameras have a thing called in-body image stabilization, which is the sensor basically sits on a mount that offsets, again, any camera motions. So while these technical elements can help offset slower shutter speeds, and you might still be able to get a sharp photo where you want it to be sharp, just be aware of at some point that will not work anymore, and you would need a tripod if you want a sharp photo. So next what I'm going to do is show you how this works to freeze motion with a moving object. And the subject I'm going to use is not super interesting, but it's just cars driving down the road near where I live. The speed limit here is 40 miles an hour, and I'm going to photograph various cars moving at approximately that speed. And our goal will be to make the car looks like it's not moving, and we're going to do that with shutter speed of very short duration. So we'll start with a shutter speed where the car is moving, and we'll walk you through the sequence. So here that is. So this first photo is 1/60th of a second. 1/60. That means something you can do 60 times in 1 second. You'll notice the things that aren't moving in this photo, the trees and the lights and the signs and the road, are sharp because that duration is short enough, fast enough to offset any potential motion that I made when I was making the photo. Although the camera was on a tripod, so there was no motion. So here's why a 40-mile-an-hour object is blurry at 1/60th of a second. A 40-mile-an-hour object will move approximately 12 inches or about 1 foot in 1/60th of a second. So during that exposure time, the car moved, I don't know, about that far. So that's why it's blurry. That's why there's a trail of where the car was at the beginning of the exposure and where it was at the end of that 1/60th of a second. So my goal in this sequence of photos is to make a photo of a car driving at 40 miles an hour and make it look like it's not moving. So what I'm going to do is cut the duration of the shutter speed in half each time. So it's going to be shorter duration. So with fractions, the way that works, that means that bottom number, the denominator of the fraction, will get larger. I'm going to make the duration half as long. So I'm going to double the bottom number basically. So this one, I know 1 over 125 is not double 1 over 60. This is kind of a throwback to older cameras. They had shutter increments of 160 and then 1 over 125. So that's what I'm going to do here. So there's less motion in the subject that's moving at about the same speed. It's not as blurry. So we're going to double again the bottom number, which is half as much time. So we'll go to 1 over 250. Then we'll go to 1 over 500. We've almost frozen the motion. Mostly the motion that's happening now is just a little bit in the vehicle, but it's most noticeable in the rotation of the tires. And then when we get to 1 over 1000, and it makes a moving object at 40 miles an hour look like it's not moving. So that's kind of the magic number for a 40-mile-an-hour object. You can stop the motion, make it look like it's not moving at around 1/1000th of a second. So in sports photography, fast shutter speeds are used to freeze the motion and get those really powerful microseconds of action and freeze them in time. So we can go the other way with motion and embrace the blur, show the blur, imply motion with longer duration shutter speeds, and that's going to look like this. So here's motion that is not frozen, and instead it's blurred, and that gives it a sense of even more motion, gives a sense of the movement. This ride at the fair is moving right around, and this is at 1 over 30th of a second. Here's another example. Things are not moving very quickly in this photo, but the clouds and the water waves are moving a little bit. So with a 20-second exposure, they kind of all blend together, and that creates this look. Now, at the third bullet point, when I was talking about shutter speed, I mentioned that you can have unintentional camera movement and get a blur or lack of sharpness in your photo that you don't want. There's a whole genre of photography called intentional camera movement, where you use longer shutter speeds and then move the camera to create sometimes abstract photos that can be quite interesting. It's fun to experiment with. One of the nice things about digital photography is every click of the shutter button doesn't really cost you any money. So it's fun to experiment, and longer exposures with intentional camera movement can be really quite interesting and fun to play with. I'm going to show you an example next. So here's an example of intentional camera movement. The shutter speed is 1/8 of a second, and I move the camera, I think, left to right or right to left. So this is looking out the window at the Student Union in Highline College. And so at the bottom of the scene are chairs and tables, and at the top of the scene is the window with the trees outside and the blue sky. So the movement of the camera creates this blur that is abstract and potentially, hopefully, interesting. So if you want to learn more about intentional camera movement, there is a hashtag for that on Instagram. Hashtag ICM, or intentional movement, I think, is another one. But there's lots of photographers doing really interesting work with this. And it's a fun way to play and have a little bit of organicness and unpredictability in what can be a very predictable way of creating photos with a digital camera. So that's shutter speed. Shutter speed can make your photo brighter or darker, as you expect from an exposure control. But the characteristic of the photo that changes as you're going for longer time or shorter time of light is the appearance of motion in the photo. So do the elements in the photo look like they're moving or not? That's controlled by shutter speed. Next up, we have aperture. And aperture is a little harder to understand mathematically, and also a little more difficult to understand how it affects the photo besides making the photo brighter or darker. But I have confidence that you can understand it, hopefully a little bit better after just a few minutes here. So here we go. So aperture, I refer to as the volume of light. That's not, if you talk to a physics instructor, that's not correct. But the way I like to imagine it is if you had light in a bucket, how big is that bucket? The aperture refers to the size of the opening in the camera lens to let in light. So as you might imagine with aperture, if we have a larger opening, we get more light. And if we have a smaller opening, we have less light. In addition to the photo getting brighter with a large opening and darker with a small opening, we're also changing what's in focus in the photo, which is called depth of field. Depth of field is not easy to predict in a photo because there's lots of variables besides aperture that determines how much of the photo is going to be in focus. We'll get to that in a couple minutes here. So just a note about how this all works. If you have a smaller aperture number, which are also called f-stops, you'll get more light. So the smaller number of an aperture means you have a larger opening in the lens. And when you have that larger opening, you get lots of light, but you will have less of the scene in focus, shallower depth of field. So the opposite of that is true. If you have a larger aperture number, you will get less light, but you'll have more in focus, a deeper depth of field. I know, it's a little confusing. Let's add a little more confusion to the mix. So here's a sequence of photos of various size aperture openings. So in the top left is aperture of f1.8, which is the largest opening on that specific lens. And in the bottom right is aperture of f22, the smallest opening on that lens. So again, the smaller number is a larger opening and more light. Another confusing element of aperture is the numbers do not progress, the amount of light you get does not progress arithmetically. So for example, 2.8, you can do the reasoning that, okay, it's a smaller number, so I'm going to get more light, and I must get twice as much light as f5.6 because it's half the size of it. Unfortunately, that's not true. Aperture numbers move in a different scale. So f4 is half as much light as 2.8, and 5.6 is half as much light as f4. I know, it's complicated. I wasn't on the committee that decided these things, but that's how it works. It takes a little bit of time to get your head around how the numbers works, or at least it did for me. But again, that's something with repetition will make more sense the more you do it. So here's an example of how aperture works. We're going to start with some Lego friends on a picnic table. Each of these 6 figures is about 1.5 inches behind the one in front of it. So at aperture of f1.4 on the lens I'm using here, which is a 35mm lens, approximately 1.5 feet or so away from the subjects, only the front subject is in focus. Just that single orange figure is in focus. The subject that's immediately behind is already a little bit out of focus. As you go farther away, each subject gets more out of focus until you get to the background, which is just blurry balls of light and texture and color. So what I'm going to do in the sequence of photos here is make the aperture smaller, and you'll notice that the scene becomes more in focus. So we'll go to 2.0, which is the next one, and then 2.8, 4.0, 5.6, 8.0, 11, and 16, which is the smallest opening on that lens I was using. So now we have the whole Lego team in focus, and the background is also more in focus, even though it's still a little blurry. So this is another way you can tell stories in your photos, by changing what's in focus. When more of the scene is in focus, every element of the scene has to work together and be considered in the photo. And it's a different story than if just one element is in focus and sharp focus and everything else is less in focus. Then you can concentrate more on just that one thing, and the other elements are not quite as important. So a kind of a brief summary of aperture is that it's the size of the opening in the lens, and as you change the size of that opening to make it smaller or larger, you're going to change the amount of light in the photo, but you're also going to change how much of the photo is in focus from front to back. And how much of the photo is in focus is called depth of field. So there's a total of 5 elements that affect depth of field, how much of that scene is in focus. The first one is aperture. That often has the most direct effect. The second is the focal length of the lens. And the more telephoto your lens is, you'll have shallower depth of field, less in focus. A wider angle lens will have more in focus at any given aperture. The third element in determining depth of field is how close the lens is to the subject. If you're closer to your subject, you will have generally a shallower depth of field. And then the fourth element is how far the subject is from the background. If your subject is relatively farther away from your background, you'll have shallower depth of field, less in focus. And lastly, the fifth element in determining depth of field is the size of the sensor in your camera. The larger your sensor, the less depth of field you'll have at any of those other four elements that determine depth of field. I know there's a lot of science going on there. So again, the more you practice it, the more you try different variables, changing those variables to get an understanding of it, the better understanding you will have of it. So I hope that makes sense. Next up, we're going to talk about the third ingredient in creating exposure in our photos, which is ISO. So ISO is all about sensitivity, and ISO actually stands for International Standards Organization, and it applies to other things in the world besides just camera sensor sensitivity to light. But it's the standardized way we use in photography to measure the electronic amplification of the camera sensor's sensitivity to light. So as we increase the amplification of light, you're going to get more light. If you decrease that amplification of light, you will have less light. And one of the nice things about ISO is it's probably the easiest to understand mathematically, because if the number is twice as large, you get twice as much amplification and twice as much light, and we don't have to deal with any fractions. So as we're changing that amplification, just like if you're change the amplification when you're listening to music and you turn the music up too loud, you're going to start to get noise. And related to that is every camera has different levels of ISO that you can get to before you start getting to too much noise. And how much is too much noise? That's very individually specific. Everybody, in my experience, has a little bit different tolerances for noise in their photos, and the people who tend to worry most about noise in their photos are people who review cameras for a living. Most of the rest of us, the noise is not very noticeable or much of an issue in our photos. And one of the nice things about Fujifilm cameras, in my experience, is the noise is pretty gentle and gracious. By that, I mean, it doesn't look very digital. It looks a little bit like film grain from back in the film days, in that it feels a little more organic than some other cameras I've seen. When their noise levels get high in a photo, it looks very digital. So let's show some examples of how ISO works using these photos. This is a studio photo of a lens. And what I'm going to do is start at ISO 100, which for some cameras is their starting point. This varies by camera, and it's connected to the type of sensor and how it's engineered. So then we're going to start at 100, and then I'm going to jump all the way to 6,400 ISO, which sounds like a huge number. And even though it is, it really isn't. And here's what I mean. With ISO, like most exposure settings, what we do is we want to double the light or cut the light in half, which is called a stop of light. So if we start at 100 and we double, we go from 100 to 200, 200 to 400, 400 to 800, 800 to 1600, 1600 to 3200, and then 3200 to 6400. So it's 6 stops of light from 100 to 6400. And let me show you what it looks like when we get from, we'll start back again at 100, and then I'll show you 6400, and then we'll go up from there. So again, here's 100. Notice that everything is sharp and all the details are clean and clear. Look especially at the number 50 right below the 100. So here's 6,400. So notice now we have some grain showing up, some little speckles showing up in the photo, and we've lost some sharpness. 25,600 is 2 stops more of light from 6,400. So we've gone a total of 8 stops, and you're looking at this and you might be going, oh my goodness, why would you do this? Here's why you would do that. That very first photo at ISO 100 was an 8-second exposure. Because I wanted the whole image in focus, I needed a smaller aperture opening, larger number, which means I have less light from there. And if I wanted the most image detail, that means I needed the lowest ISO, which means I needed the most time. All three of these exposure ingredients are connected. I can get more or less light from one or the other, and determining how I want to tell the story, what the most important element in the photo is, will determine what settings I might use. So back to ISO. So that 25,600 ISO photo was 1/15 of a second exposure, which I could potentially hold still for if I did a drive mode where I increased the number of frames per second, and one of those photos was in between when I was moving just a little bit because I had too much caffeine at lunch. Okay. So, but here's the cool thing about ISO and noise. We can reduce ISO noise in our photos. Especially modern software is really good at helping remove ISO noise. So here's what that looks like. So here's with a little bit of noise reduction. This is just a couple sliders in Lightroom, and it looks so much better. So we can remove ISO noise or make it less obvious, but if a photo has blur from camera movement or motion of the subject, currently, as I'm recording this, there's no way to software fix that. So we can't change motion appearance, but we can change the appearance of noise in a photo. So that's why you might turn your ISO up to get to a photo where you can raise your shutter speed to a faster speed so that you can freeze motion. I know there's a lot of stuff going on here. Send me an email. I'll leave a contact form link down below if you have more questions. So back to ISO for just a minute and a little bit more conversation about noise. As I mentioned, noise for most people isn't really an issue because we don't really notice it in our photos for lots of reasons. One of those reasons is most of our photos these days are on screens. So they're on potentially a small phone screen. So when you shrink something, you hide details, and noise mostly hides in the details. Another reason is because of what I'm going to show you next, I was exaggerating the noise appearance a little bit because I had zoomed in on the photo. So here's what it actually was. So this is 100. This is the whole photo. What we were looking at was the detail of the photo zoomed in on the zoom ring and the depth of field scale window. So here's 6,400. We could see that when we were zoomed in, but you can't probably see it now. Here's even 25,600. Doesn't look that bad when you're zoomed out, and if you hadn't seen the other photo. We add a little noise reduction and a little bit of color correction, it looks better still, so that unless you have the 100 ISO to compare it to, this is going to look just fine. So that was a semi-quick introduction to exposure. It's something you will use obviously in every photo. And one of the choices you have to make when you're creating photos is, how do you want to control exposure? Do you want to control it, or do you want to let the camera control it? Or do you kind of want to partner and you control part of it and let the camera control the other part? So the cool thing is you have those choices to make, and Fujifilm cameras make that pretty easy to do. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is the different modes, the different ways you control exposure with a Fujifilm camera. So the first things to talk about is, with Fujifilm cameras, there are two basic ways to control exposure. There's two different setups for exposure controls. On the left here is an XT series camera with the traditional exposure dials. On the left of that camera is the ISO. On the right of the viewfinder is the shutter speed. And then the dial on the far right is called exposure compensation. We'll get to that. The aperture, which you don't see in this photo, is because it's on the lens, which I have not included in this photo. I will include in another one. But that's where aperture is controlled, is on the lens. The camera on the right is an XH2S, an H series camera, and you'll notice at the top left is a dial with the MASP around it and a bunch of Cs. We've talked about the custom dials. That's what the C's stand for. The M is for manual, the A is for aperture, the S is for shutter, and the P is for program. So this camera controls the exposure settings with two dials that are on the right-hand side of the camera, one on the back of the camera that you use with your thumb, and one on the right of the front of the camera on the grip that you control with your right index finger. So command dial cameras include the XH2S, the XH2, the XS20, the XS10 as of this recording, which is February 2024. The traditional exposure dials cameras in the Fujifilm lineup currently are the X-T5, the X-T32, the X-Pro 3, and the X100VI, which was just announced. So there's two different approaches to managing the exposure settings in the cameras, and those different systems will do it in each a different way. I'll walk you through it for each one. So before we get into the differences between the different exposure modes, I thought I would share my thoughts on this. If you're brand new to photography and you're a little overwhelmed by all the things here, or if the math of exposure just doesn't make sense to you, I totally understand that. Here's an example. I photograph in manual mode, so I set everything on exposure myself. My wife sets her camera up in program mode, which she lets the camera do all the exposure math, and she concentrates on creating a composition that looks good to her without the extra thinking involved in what do I need to change to get this to be the brightness I want. So there's no right or wrong in my opinion, and especially as you're getting started, my encouragement to you would be to use program mode to let the camera set the aperture, set the shutter speed, set the ISO, and you do the artistic, creative, hard part of the making photos, which is choosing what to point your camera at, where to place the camera, and when to make the photo. So program mode means the camera is going to do all the work of creating the brightness in your photo. So that means the camera will set all the exposure controls of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So if you want to adjust the exposure though, if you make a photo and you go, oh, I'd like it a little brighter or a little darker, there's a very, very easy way to do that. And that's called exposure compensation, which on the XT series cameras is a dial on the top of the camera that you can rotate to plus to make your photo brighter, or minus to make your photo darker, and you don't have to do any math. So here's what it looks like if you're in program mode on the two different camera types. So again, on the left are the XT series cameras with the exposure dials. On the right is the XH series camera with the command dials. That's what I call it. I'm not sure what the official language is. So on the left, if your camera has the traditional exposure dials, if you rotate them all to the A setting, so the shutter speed, ISO, and aperture on the lens, if you rotate that all to the A setting, you are now in program mode where the camera is going to be automatic for those three controls. On the XH series cameras and the other cameras that have this type of mode dial, you just rotate it to P, and now you're in program mode. Next up is shutter priority mode, and this mode is what you would use if you want to set the shutter speed because it's important for you to control the appearance of motion. So if you want to freeze motion by setting a very fast shutter speed, you would use this. Or if you want to blur motion to enhance the sense of movement or create an intentional camera movement photo, this is the setting that you would easily use. So all you do is set the shutter speed and the camera is going to determine the ISO and aperture. And again, Here, you can now still use exposure compensation to adjust the photo brighter or darker after you've made one and decide what you want to do next. So shutter priority mode on the XT series cameras looks like this. So the ISO is still on A, the aperture is still on A on the lens, and now the shutter speed dial is now rotated to a specific shutter speed. In this case, it's 1/500. I know there's no fractions shown on the dials, but that's how it works. And then on the XH series cameras, it's rotated to the S, which stands for shutter priority. So this is used when you want to, again, control the appearance of motion in your photo. Next, we have aperture priority mode. So this is where depth of field is an important element in the story of the photo. How much of the scene is in focus? So in this case, you're going to set the aperture, the size of the lens opening, to control the amount of light that way, which will also control the amount of the scene in focus. As I mentioned, this is used to control depth of field. And again, we still have exposure compensation as our easy plus or minus way to add light to the photo after the camera makes its own settings to do that. So an aperture priority settings on the camera dials looks like this. On the left, the XT series cameras. Again, the ISO is on A, the shutter speed dial is on A. Now on the lens, by rotating the aperture dial off of the A. On the XH series camera, now we've moved to also rotate the mode dial to A, and now we adjust the aperture on the lens to change that setting. So in manual mode, you're going to choose aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And there's lots of reasons you might want to do that. I'll get to that in a minute. But in this case, you're in complete control of exposure. So the more you understand about exposure, the more you can leverage these different settings to get the looks you want. The next statement I have here is that it's used for maximum control of exposure. And here's what I mean by that. So if you're looking at me, if the camera is pointed and I'm in the middle of the frame, it's going to make one exposure if you're in auto mode. It'll have one set of settings. So whether you're in program mode, aperture priority, or shutter priority, it would create an exposure. Those are called the auto modes, based on the amount of light on my face if you had me in the center, and there you go. Now, if you wanted to instead make an exposure on my ampersand symbol here in the back, and you instead focused on that, it's going to change the amount of light on my face because it's darker back there, even though the amount of light on my face didn't change. So that's what I mean by having complete control over exposure. Sometimes the camera doesn't quite read your mind, and it doesn't do the exposure that you wanted. So for me, I've moved to manual exposure because now I'm, in most situations, quicker than the camera would be to get just to the right exposure I want. Plus, I'm a control freak, so there you go. So manual exposure on the XT series cameras looks like this with the dials on the left. So you've chosen a specific aperture on the lens, you've chosen a specific shutter speed on the right dial of the viewfinder, and you've chosen a specific ISO on the left dial of the viewfinder. On the XH series camera and the XS10 and 20, you rotate the mode dial to the M, which stands for manual, and now you're ready to set all the settings yourself for exposure. So that's a semi-brief conversation about exposure, how aperture, shutter speed, ISO work to control light, in addition to how they change different characteristics of the photos. So if you have questions, because this was just the start, please leave a comment down below. I'll also leave in the description below a link to my contact form email, and I'm glad to answer questions that way as well. But my biggest encouragement to you at this point is to pick up your camera and practice creating photos with it. Try all these different things if you want. Experiment, play, use this tool in the way that most makes sense for you. I hope you have lots of fun creating photos with your camera. I hope you enjoy the process of creating photos, of learning all these different ingredients to creating exposures and how it changes and gives you more options for creating photos with your cameras. I'd love to see the photos you're creating. I'll leave a link to social media for myself down below. And if you follow me, I will follow back. So I'd love to see what you're doing with your camera. I hope you're having lots of fun. So that concludes part 3 of this video series. Part number 4 will be about the Q menu in Fujifilm cameras, as well as the Viewfinder display in Fujifilm cameras. Hope to see you in that next video. Until then, stay safe, stay well, and have fun creating photos. Bye for now.